Somewhere along the Mississippi River, in a parish whose name has been deliberately obscured from official records, there existed a plantation where 17 men died under circumstances so disturbing that Louisiana authorities ordered all documentation burned in 1847. What makes this case truly unsettling isn't the number of deaths, but a single repeated detail found in every witness account. Each man had been found clutching a small piece of indigo-dyed cloth, their eyes wide open, and on their lips, the same whispered name. The woman they spoke of was described in plantation ledgers as the most sought-after property in the entire Delta region, yet no bill of sale for her has ever been recovered. For over a century and a half, this story has been deliberately erased from Louisiana's historical record, passed down only through fragments of diary entries, coded letters between plantation owners, and testimonies that were sealed by court order until 1952. What happened on that unnamed plantation reveals something far more terrifying than any ghost story. The calculated patience of a woman who understood exactly how desire could become a weapon, and how men's obsessions could orchestrate their own destruction. Before we continue with the story of what became known in hushed whispers as the Indigo Terror, I need you to do something. If you're fascinated by stories where historical truth is stranger and darker than fiction, hit that subscribe button right now. And in the comments, tell me what state or city you're listening from, because this story touches on a darkness that existed across the entire South, and I want to know where my audience is discovering these forgotten horrors. Now let me take you back to a time when human beings were bought and sold like cattle, and show you how one woman turned that very system into an instrument of methodical revenge. The Mississippi Delta in 1839 was a landscape of contradictions. Magnificent columned mansions rose from swampland, their white paint gleaming against a backdrop of cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. The air itself seemed to carry wealth, thick and heavy with the scent of sugarcane and cotton, crops that generated fortunes measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars. This was the richest agricultural region in America, and everyone knew that wealth was built on the bent backs of enslaved people, working from dawn until darkness swallowed the fields whole. St. Landry Parish, though that wasn't its real name then, was particularly prosperous. The parish boasted 47 major plantations, each operating as its own small kingdom, with absolute power vested in the owner. These men, mostly French Creole families who'd held their land since before the Louisiana Purchase, competed fiercely with one another. They competed in crop yields, in the grandeur of their homes, in the pedigree of their horses, and most disturbingly, in the quality and appearance of their human property. In this world of brutal hierarchy and grotesque social rituals, there existed an underground market that polite society never acknowledged in daylight, but everyone participated in after dark. Certain enslaved women, those deemed exceptionally beautiful by the standards of the time, became objects of intense competition among wealthy planters. They were traded, gifted, and occasionally fought over in ways that plantation ledgers carefully avoided documenting. The practice was so common that it had developed its own coded language in correspondence between plantation owners. Into this world, in the spring of 1839, arrived a woman whose appearance in surviving descriptions seems almost deliberately designed to torment the men who would encounter her. She was brought to St. Landry Parish by a cotton broker named Lysander Thibault, a man known for acquiring rare and valuable property for the wealthiest planters in Louisiana. The woman, identified in his personal journal only as the Gautier acquisition, had been purchased from a declining estate in Charleston, South Carolina, for the staggering sum of $3,000, more than 3 times the price of a skilled male field hand. What made her so valuable? Thibault's journal, discovered in an attic in Baton Rouge in 1923, provides troubling insight. He described her as possessing extraordinary classical features, skin the color of burnished copper, unusual height and bearing, and eyes of such penetrating intelligence that even hardened overseers found themselves uncomfortable in her presence. But it was another quality he noted that should have served as a warning: She possesses a stillness that seems almost unnatural, as though she is always watching, always calculating. I confess she unsettles me, though I cannot articulate why. The woman was 26 years old, unusually old for such a purchase. Most enslaved women in this particular trade were much younger, teenagers or women in their early 20s. Her age alone suggested something unusual in her history, a depth of experience that most men either didn't notice or chose to ignore in their eagerness to possess her. Thibault had planned to sell her at a private auction to the highest bidder among 5 of the wealthiest planters in the parish. But before that auction could take place, something happened that would set in motion a chain of events no one could have predicted. The woman escaped, or rather she appeared to escape. On the night before the scheduled auction, she vanished from the locked room where Thibault had been keeping her in a boarding house in Opelousas, the parish seat. The door remained locked from the outside. The window was barred. Yet when Thibault entered the room the next morning, she was gone, leaving behind only a piece of indigo cloth torn from her dress and a smell that witnesses described as resembling oleander flowers, sweet and slightly poisonous. The entire parish erupted in search parties. Slave patrols scoured the swamps and waterways. Rewards were posted. But here's where the story takes its first disturbing turn. Within 3 days, the woman reappeared voluntarily at the plantation of a man named Sébastien Duval, walking up the oak-lined drive in broad daylight, as if she'd simply been out for a stroll. Duval was one of the wealthiest planters in Louisiana, owner of over 200 enslaved people and 3,000 acres of prime sugar-cane land. He was 43 years old, recently widowed, and known for his cold business acumen. He was also one of the 5 men who'd been invited to bid on the woman at Thibault's auction. When questioned about why she'd come to his plantation specifically, the woman, who Duval would later name Celeste in his records, gave an answer that should have chilled everyone who heard it. "I chose you." Those 3 words represented something unprecedented in a system built entirely on the premise that enslaved people had no choices whatsoever. Yet Duval, rather than being disturbed, seemed flattered. He immediately paid Thibault double the asking price, $6,000, and took possession of her that very day. Within a week, Celeste had been installed not in the slave quarters, but in a small cottage on Duval's property, a building that had previously housed his late wife's lady's maid. She was given fine clothes, her own servant, and most shocking of all, she was seen walking the gardens with Duval himself, sometimes for hours at a time. The scandal rippled through plantation society like a stone thrown into still water. White women whispered behind fans. Other planters watched with a mixture of envy and disapproval. Duval's own family wrote letters expressing their concern about his judgment, but Duval seemed utterly indifferent to public opinion, wrapped in what observers described as an almost trance-like infatuation. What no one knew, what wouldn't be discovered until much later, was that Celeste had studied Sébastien Duval for years before ever arriving in St. Landry Parish. She'd learned his patterns, his weaknesses, his secret correspondence with other planters. She knew about his financial troubles, carefully hidden behind the facade of wealth. She knew about his debts, his failing sugar crop, and most importantly, she knew about the 5 other men who competed with him for social dominance in the parish, and she had a plan that would destroy them all. 3 months after Celeste's arrival at the Duval plantation, on a humid August night when the air hung so thick you could almost see it, Sébastien Duval hosted what would become known as the last dinner party he would ever give. The invitation list was carefully curated. Armand Leclerc, owner of the neighboring plantation and Duval's chief rival in sugar production; Octave Rousseau, a cotton planter whose family had held land in the parish since 1780; Théophile Boudreau, the youngest of the group at 37, who'd recently inherited his father's estate; and Philippe Saunier, the parish judge whose influence extended into every aspect of local law and society. These 5 men, including Duval, represented the absolute pinnacle of power in that corner of Louisiana. Between them, they owned over 1,000 human beings, controlled tens of thousands of acres, and held the economic fate of hundreds of families in their hands. The evening began conventionally enough. The men gathered in Duval's library, a room paneled in imported mahogany, drinking French cognac and smoking Cuban cigars while discussing crop prices and political developments in Washington. Dinner was served at 8 o'clock in the formal dining room. Turtle soup, roasted duck, oysters prepared 3 different ways, all accompanied by wines that cost more per bottle than most families earned in a month. But the atmosphere throughout the meal was strained. Every man present knew about Celeste, and every man present wanted to see her. Duval had been deliberately vague in his letters about whether she would appear at the dinner, playing on their curiosity, their competitiveness, their desire. It wasn't until dessert was being cleared that Duval finally made his move. He rang a small silver bell, and the door to the dining room opened. Celeste entered wearing a dress of deep indigo blue, a color that in certain lights appeared almost black. The dress was modest by evening standards, covering her from neck to wrist to ankle, yet something about the way it was tailored, the way it moved with her, commanded absolute attention. She carried herself with a bearing that seemed to contradict every assumption these men held about enslaved people. Her eyes, described by one witness as having an almost golden quality in candlelight, swept across the 5 men at the table with an expression that was both utterly composed and somehow challenging. Philippe Saunier, the judge, would later write in a private letter to his brother in New Orleans, "I have seen beautiful women in my life, in Paris and New York, women trained in every art of attraction. But I have never encountered anyone who seemed so completely aware of her own power, so utterly in control of the room, despite having no legal rights whatsoever. It was deeply unsettling." Duval introduced her simply as Celeste, offering no explanation of her presence. The men at the table struggled visibly with how to respond. Social convention said they should ignore an enslaved person's presence entirely, yet doing so seemed impossible. She spoke only once during the entire encounter, her voice low and clear with an accent that none of them could quite place. Duval had asked her to recite a piece of poetry, a French verse, which she delivered flawlessly. But it was what she did after finishing the recitation that would haunt every man in that room. She looked directly at each of them in turn, letting her gaze rest on their faces for just a moment longer than was comfortable. And then she smiled. Not a submissive smile, not an inviting smile, but something else entirely. Something that suggested she knew secrets about each of them that they desperately wanted to keep hidden. Then she left the room as silently as she'd entered, leaving behind only the faint scent of oleander. The dinner party ended shortly after midnight. Each man departed with carefully maintained composure, but within a week, something astonishing began to happen. Letters started arriving at the Duval plantation, letters from each of the 4 guests, all containing offers to purchase Celeste. The amounts were staggering. Armand Leclerc offered $8,000. Octave Rousseau countered with $10,000. Théophile Boudreau, the youngest and most impulsive, offered $12,000 plus a prime breeding mare worth another $2,000. But it was Philippe Saunier's letter that revealed the depth of obsession that had taken root that night. The judge, a man known for his cold rationality and strict interpretation of law, wrote to Duval, "Name your price. Whatever you want, I will pay it. I must have her. I will not be at peace until I do." Duval's responses to these letters, preserved in Saunier's estate papers, show a man who had himself become unpredictable. He refused all offers, but his refusals were taunting, almost cruel. He described in detail how intelligent Celeste was, how she could discuss literature and music, how she seemed to understand him in ways his late wife never had. This went on for 6 weeks, this exchange of increasingly desperate offers and increasingly mocking refusals. The social fabric of the parish began to fray. Old friendships deteriorated. Business partnerships became strained. All because of one woman who said almost nothing, but seemed to occupy every man's thoughts. Then, on October 3rd, 1839, Sébastien Duval was found dead in his study. The circumstances were immediately suspicious. Duval was discovered slumped over his desk, a half-written letter before him, his hand still clutching a pen. His eyes were wide open, staring at something no one else could see. And grasped in his other hand was a piece of indigo cloth, torn from what appeared to be a woman's dress. The local doctor, summoned immediately, could find no obvious cause of death, no wounds, no signs of poison in the conventional sense, no evidence of violence. Duval's heart had simply stopped, the doctor concluded, perhaps from some sudden apoplexy or seizure. But there were details that didn't fit that explanation. The letter Duval had been writing was addressed to Armand Leclerc, and its content was disturbing. "You must not pursue this further. She is not what you think. I have made a terrible mistake in bringing her here. If you value your life and your soul, you will forget you ever saw—" The sentence ended there, the ink trailing off where his hand had stopped moving. More troubling still was what the household servants reported. They said that the night before his death, Duval had been heard arguing with someone in his study, his voice rising in what sounded like fear or anger. But when servants listened at the door, they heard only one voice, his own. No one else was in the room with him. And Celeste, she had vanished again. Her cottage was found empty, the bed made, her few possessions gone. The only thing left behind was a smell of oleander and another piece of indigo cloth, this one folded carefully on the pillow. The parish authorities, led by Judge Philippe Saunier, conducted an investigation. Slave patrols were dispatched to search for Celeste. Rewards were posted. But as the investigation proceeded, Saunier made a decision that would prove fatal. He ordered that the search be conducted quietly without public announcement to avoid scandal. In truth, he didn't want her found by anyone but himself. The investigation into Sébastien Duval's death quickly became something else entirely. A competition between 4 men, each trying to locate Celeste before the others could. Armand Leclerc, whose plantation bordered Duval's property, organized private search parties composed of his most trusted overseers. He offered substantial rewards to anyone who could provide information about her whereabouts, rewards he funded by secretly selling off parcels of land, a fact that wouldn't become known until his estate was settled years later. Octave Rousseau took a different approach. He hired a slave tracker from Mississippi, a man named Caleb Frost, who had a reputation for finding runaways no matter how far they'd run or how well they'd hidden. Rousseau paid Frost $500 up front and promised another $1,000 if he brought Celeste back alive and unharmed. Théophile Boudreau, the youngest of the group, became almost manic in his search. He spent entire days riding through the swamps and back roads, questioning every free person of color, every shopkeeper, every river pilot. His obsession became so obvious that his family staged an intervention, pleading with him to abandon this pursuit and focus on his plantation, which was suffering from his neglect. But it was Judge Philippe Saunier who should have known better. As the legal authority investigating Duval's death, he had access to resources the others didn't: court records, property deeds, correspondence between plantations. He began systematically reviewing every transaction involving enslaved people in the parish over the past 5 years, looking for any mention of Celeste or any woman matching her description. What he found should have warned him. He discovered that Celeste had been sold 4 times before arriving in Louisiana, and at each previous location, something disturbing had occurred. In Charleston, the man who'd owned her had died suddenly of what was described as brain fever. In Savannah before that, 2 brothers who'd competed to purchase her had killed each other in a duel, though no one could quite remember what they'd been dueling about. In Virginia, a planter who'd acquired her had lost everything in a single disastrous business decision and hanged himself in his tobacco barn. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it, but Saunier's obsession blinded him to the obvious interpretation. Instead of recognizing danger, he convinced himself that he was different from these other men. that he could possess her without suffering their fate. While these 4 men searched, autumn turned to winter, and the Louisiana weather became unpredictable, swinging between warm, humid days and sudden cold snaps that killed the late-blooming flowers. The atmosphere in St. Landry Parish grew increasingly strange. Neighbors who'd been friends for decades stopped speaking to one another. Wives complained that their husbands seemed distracted, absent even when physically present. Business deals fell through. A pall seemed to have settled over the entire region. Then, in early December, Celeste reappeared. She was found walking along the River Road, the main thoroughfare that connected the plantations, moving with that same unhurried grace that characterized everything about her. She made no attempt to hide or run when a patrol spotted her. Instead, she simply stood and waited as they approached. The patrol leader, uncertain what to do with such valuable property, took her directly to Judge Saunier's plantation. It was, after all, Saunier who'd been leading the official investigation into Duval's death and her disappearance. Saunier had her placed in one of the unused overseer's houses on his property, a small but comfortable building with its own fireplace and furniture. He posted guards outside but gave strict orders that she was not to be mistreated in any way. That evening he visited her himself, bringing food and wine, candles and books. What was said between them that night is unknown. No one was close enough to hear their conversation. But witnesses reported seeing candlelight flickering in the windows until nearly dawn, and they heard something else that troubled them. Laughter. Not Sonia's deep baritone, but a woman's laugh, low and knowing, carrying through the cold December air. The next morning, Saunier sent letters to Leclerc, Rousseau, and Boudreau. The letters were identical, brief and cruel in their brevity. The matter we have all been concerned with has been resolved. The property in question is now in my possession and will remain so. I strongly suggest you abandon any further interest in this affair. The responses he received revealed men on the edge of rational thought. Leclerc's letter was barely coherent, mixing rage with pleading. Rousseau's was cold and threatening, implying that legal action might be taken. Boudreau's was the most disturbing, a rambling 10-page document that alternated between professing his love for a woman he'd seen for less than an hour and describing dreams he'd been having. Dreams where she called to him from dark water. Saunier ignored them all. For 3 weeks he spent every evening in that overseer's house, sometimes staying until dawn. His wife, a woman from a prominent New Orleans family, left the plantation and returned to her father's home, taking their 3 children with her. Saunier didn't seem to notice or care. Those who saw him during this period reported a dramatic change in his appearance. He lost weight. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. His normally impeccable dress became disheveled. But more than his physical appearance, it was his behavior that alarmed people. He began making erratic legal decisions, ruling in favor of plaintiffs he'd previously opposed, dismissing cases that should have gone to trial. His fellow judges quietly began discussing whether he was still competent to serve on the bench. Then, on December 27, 1839, just before dawn, a slave from Saunier's plantation ran to the main house, shouting that something terrible had happened at the overseer's cottage. They found Judge Philippe Saunier lying in bed, his eyes wide open staring at the ceiling. Like Duval before him, there were no obvious signs of violence or injury, but clutched in his hand was a piece of indigo cloth, and on his face was an expression that those who saw it described as pure terror, as if he'd seen something in his final moments that had frozen his heart in his chest. Celeste was gone. The guards posted outside swore no one had entered or left the building during the night, yet she had vanished as completely as smoke in wind, leaving behind only that distinctive scent of oleander and another carefully folded piece of indigo cloth on the pillow. 2 men dead within 3 months, both found in identical circumstances, and 3 men still obsessed with finding the woman who connected them. The parish was about to learn that some hunts are carefully orchestrated by the prey. The death of Judge Philippe Saunier should have ended this madness. It should have served as a clear warning to Armand Leclerc, Octave Rousseau, and Théophile Boudreau that pursuing Celeste led only to destruction. But obsession operates by its own logic, untouched by reason or self-preservation. In fact, Saulnier's death intensified their pursuit. Now there were only 3 men competing instead of 5. The prize seemed closer, more attainable. What none of them understood was that they weren't hunting her. She was positioning each of them exactly where she wanted them. In the weeks following Saulnier's death, the official investigation took on a surreal quality. The new judge assigned to the case, a man from Baton Rouge who knew nothing of the local dynamics, quickly found himself frustrated by witnesses who couldn't seem to remember details or who contradicted themselves from one interview to the next. The household servants at both the Duval and Saulnier plantations provided testimony that was almost uselessly vague. The physician who'd examined both bodies performed a second, more thorough examination of Saulnier's corpse, looking for anything he might have missed. He found something peculiar. Small traces of what appeared to be plant residue under Saulnier's fingernails and in his mouth, as if he'd been chewing on leaves. The plant was eventually identified as oleander, every part of which is highly toxic to humans. Even handling the plant can cause skin irritation. Consuming it can cause cardiac arrest. But the physician couldn't determine if Saulnier had ingested enough to kill him, and more puzzling, why a judge who surely knew the dangers of oleander would consume it. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure of unknown origin, and the investigation was quietly closed. Meanwhile, in the broader community, something else was happening. Stories began to circulate about Celeste, stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Some said she was the daughter of a Haitian priestess, trained in dark arts that could bend men's wills. Others claimed she'd been educated in France, taught by courtesans how to manipulate wealthy men. Still others whispered she'd made a pact with something unholy, trading her soul for the power to destroy those who enslaved people. None of these stories were true, but they served a purpose. They obscured the real truth, which was simultaneously simpler and more terrifying. Celeste was simply a woman who'd learned to use the only weapons available to her in a system designed to strip her of all power. She understood that men like Duval, Saulnier, Leclerc, Rousseau, and Boudreau saw enslaved women as objects to possess, and she turned that very desire into a trap. In late January of 1840, Caleb Frost, the slave tracker Octave Rousseau had hired, reported that he'd found a lead. A free woman of color living in New Orleans claimed to have seen someone matching Celeste's description staying in a boarding house in the Trem neighborhood. Rousseau immediately departed for the city, taking with him $5,000 in cash and legal documents, giving him power of attorney to purchase any property he deemed necessary. He was gone for 2 weeks. When he returned to his plantation, he brought Celeste with him. Or rather, a woman he believed was Celeste. The woman matched the physical description. The height, the copper-colored skin, the unusual eyes. But something about her seemed different to those who'd seen Celeste before. This woman was quieter, more subdued, lacking that unsettling stillness that had characterized the original. Rousseau didn't notice or didn't care. He had her installed in the finest guest room of his plantation house, not even bothering with the pretense of keeping her in slave quarters. He bought her expensive clothes, jewelry, perfume. He dismissed his longtime housekeeper when she objected to the arrangement. He spent hours each day with her, emerging only for meals and to shout at his overseers when they dared interrupt him with plantation business. Armand Leclerc and Théophile Boudreau, hearing that Rousseau had found Celeste, both rode to his plantation demanding to see her. Rousseau refused to allow them entry, standing on his porch with a loaded rifle and threatening to shoot anyone who tried to force their way in. "She chose me," he screamed at them, the same words Duval had used months before. "Just as she chose Duval, just as she chose Saulnier. And I will not die like they did, because I understand what they didn't. She needs to be treated not as property, but as a partner, as an equal." The irony of a man who owned over 300 human beings talking about equality was lost on Rousseau in his mania. But Leclerc and Boudreau heard something in his words that struck them differently. For the first time, they began to wonder if perhaps the deaths of Duval and Saunier weren't random tragedies, but something more deliberate. They began investigating in earnest, not to possess Celeste, but to understand her. They hired investigators from New Orleans to trace her history. They spoke to slave traders who'd handled her transactions. They examined bills of sale and shipping manifests. Slowly, a picture emerged that was far more disturbing than any supernatural explanation. Celeste had been born into slavery in Saint-Domingue, what is now Haiti, around 1813. She'd been brought to America as a child during the chaos following the Haitian Revolution. Her mother had been a house servant who'd learned to read and write, skills she'd passed on to her daughter in secret. Celeste had then been sold multiple times as she grew, each sale prompted by the suspicious death or ruin of her owner. But here was the key detail that Leclerc discovered in a shipping manifest from 1825. Celeste had spent 2 years on a plantation in Virginia, owned by a botanist who specialized in cultivating medicinal and poisonous plants. The botanist had used enslaved workers to tend his experimental gardens that included every toxic plant that could grow in the American South: foxglove, hemlock, nightshade, castor beans, and yes, oleander. The manifest noted that this particular botanist had died from accidental poisoning in 1827. His wife, in settling the estate, had sold off all the enslaved people who'd worked in the gardens, noting in her diary that she could not bear to keep servants who knew so much about death. Armed with this information, Leclerc made a decision that showed remarkable courage or remarkable foolishness. He rode to Rousseau's plantation, demanded entry, and when refused, he shouted from the front lawn loud enough for everyone to hear, "The woman in your house is not who you think she is. She's a killer who's been murdering slave owners for over a decade. You're going to die just like Duval and Saunier if you don't listen to me." Oh, Rousseau's response was to fire his rifle over Leclerc's head and have his overseers chase him off the property. That night, Octave Rousseau sat down to dinner with the woman he believed was Celeste. The meal was prepared by her own hands. She'd insisted on cooking for him, a romantic gesture he found deeply touching. They ate by candlelight. Roasted chicken, potatoes with herbs, a salad of fresh greens, bread warm from the oven. The next morning, Octave Rousseau was found dead in his bed, his eyes wide open, a piece of indigo cloth clutched in his hand. 3 men dead, 2 left. And somewhere in Louisiana, Celeste was planning her next move. The death of Octave Rousseau finally broke through the wall of silence and denial that had protected this story from public scrutiny. The new judge assigned to investigate, a no-nonsense man named Etienne Marchand from Natchitoches, refused to accept heart failure of unknown origin as an explanation for the 3rd death in a pattern that now seemed obvious even to the most obtuse observer. Judge Marchand ordered Rousseau's body examined by a physician from New Orleans, a Dr. Henri Laval, who'd studied in Paris and had experience with forensic medicine, a relatively new field. Dr. Laval's examination revealed what the local physicians had either missed or chosen to ignore. Rousseau had died from cardiac arrest, brought on by the ingestion of cardiac glycosides, toxins found in plants like foxglove and oleander. More specifically, Dr. Laval found traces of oleander in Rousseau's stomach contents and in the residue on the dinner plates from his last meal. The salad greens, he concluded, had been mixed with young oleander leaves, which in appearance and taste are similar enough to other bitter salad greens that someone unfamiliar with plants might not notice until it was too late. The woman who'd been staying with Rousseau, the woman he'd believed was Celeste, had vanished. But this time, there was a witness. One of Rousseau's house servants, a young woman named Marie, had seen the mysterious guest leaving the plantation just before dawn on the morning Rousseau's body was discovered. Marie's testimony was careful and detailed. The woman had been carrying a small traveling bag and walking toward the river road. But what made Marie's account significant was what she said about the woman's appearance. She didn't look like the woman Master Rousseau brought home from New Orleans. Her face was different. Her walk was different. I think maybe she was wearing some kind of disguise when he found her, and now she was back to her real self. This testimony suggested something that horrified everyone who heard it. Celeste was so skilled at manipulation that she could alter her appearance enough to fool a man who'd been shown her description and had paid a professional tracker to find her. She deliberately allowed herself to be found and brought to Rousseau's plantation, playing a role until the moment was right to strike. Judge Marchand issued an arrest warrant for Celeste, charging her with 3 counts of murder. He circulated her description to every parish in Louisiana and to neighboring states. He offered a reward of $5,000 for information leading to her capture. He made it clear that she was considered extremely dangerous and should be approached with caution. But Marchand also did something else, something that showed real intelligence. He ordered the immediate protective custody of Armand Leclerc and Théophile Boudreau, the 2 remaining men from that original dinner party. Leclerc agreed to the protection without hesitation. He'd been terrified since Rousseau's death, jumping at shadows, refusing to eat food he hadn't watched being prepared, sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He moved into a hotel in Opelousas under guard, taking with him only a few trusted servants and a trunk of clothes. Théophile Boudreau, however, refused. At 20 months past that cursed dinner party, Boudreau had undergone a transformation that alarmed everyone who knew him. He'd lost perhaps 40 pounds from his already lean frame. His hair had gone prematurely gray at the temples. His hands shook constantly, and he'd developed a habit of talking to himself, carrying on conversations with someone no one else could see. When Judge Marchand came to his plantation to insist on protective custody, Boudreau met him on the front porch, disheveled and wild-eyed, and said something that would be remembered by all who heard it. "You don't understand. None of you understand. She's not coming to kill me. She's coming to free me. I've been waiting for her. I've been preparing for her. And when she arrives, I'm going to finally tell her the truth." "What truth?" Marchand asked. What was Boudreau talking about? But Boudreau just smiled, a broken, desperate smile, and said, "Ask her yourself when you find her. Ask her about the Boudreau plantation in Saint-Domingue. Ask her about the fire in 1804. Ask her about the woman and child who died in that fire. Ask her why she's doing this." Then he went inside and locked the door, refusing to speak further. Judge Marchand, troubled by this cryptic statement, returned to his office and began searching through historical records. What he found provided the first real insight into Celeste's motivation, the first glimpse of the engine driving this campaign of methodical revenge. In 1804, during the chaos of the Haitian Revolution, a French plantation owner named Gaspard Boudreau had attempted to evacuate his property and flee to Louisiana. According to ship manifests, he'd loaded a vessel with as much wealth as he could carry and a dozen enslaved people he considered most valuable. But before the ship could sail, revolutionaries attacked the plantation. In the confusion, a fire broke out. The plantation house burned to the ground. Most of Boudreau's family perished in the flames, but Gaspard himself escaped with his youngest son, then only 4 years old, and made it to the ship. That son was Théophile Boudreau's father. The ship's manifest listed the enslaved people who'd made it aboard. Among them was a woman identified only as Marguerite and child, age 5, both property of Boudreau estate. There were no further records of this Marguerite in Louisiana. She wasn't listed among the slaves registered when Gaspard Boudreau established his new plantation in St. Landry Parish. The child wasn't listed either. Judge Marchand interviewed Théophile Boudreau's elderly aunt, one of the few surviving relatives from that generation. She remembered that voyage from Haiti. She remembered Gaspard Boudreau's rage during the journey. She remembered that a woman and child had indeed been on the ship when it departed Haiti, but they weren't on the ship when it arrived in Louisiana. "What happened to them?" Marchand asked. The old woman's answer was delivered in a flat, emotionless voice. The woman had tried to escape during the fire. She'd been branded as punishment. The brand became infected during the voyage. Gaspard said she was going to die anyway and would just be a burden. He said the child would be trouble too, probably try to run away like her mother. He had them both thrown overboard somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico. He told everyone they died of fever. The other servants knew the truth, but who would believe slaves over a white man? Judge Marchand now understood. If Celeste was approximately 26 years old in 1839, she would have been born around 1813. But what if that wasn't true? What if she was older than she appeared? What if she was that 5-year-old child from the ship manifest? That would mean she'd survived somehow. Perhaps she'd been thrown overboard close enough to shore to swim or float to land. Perhaps she'd been taken aboard another vessel. However it happened, she'd survived. And she'd spent more than 3 decades planning her revenge against the men who'd killed her mother and tried to kill her. Gaspard Boudreau had died in 1831, but his son Théophile inherited his plantation, his wealth, and perhaps his guilt. The 4 other men at that dinner party, Duval, Saunier, Leclerc, and Rousseau, had all been friends and business associates of Gaspard Boudreau. They'd all profited from the Haitian plantation system. They'd all known what happened to that woman and child, or at least they'd known enough to be complicit in their silence. Celeste wasn't just killing random plantation owners. She was executing a plan of revenge that had taken decades to arrange, targeting specific men for specific reasons, using their own desires and prejudices as weapons against them. Armed with this understanding, Judge Marchand doubled the guards around Armand Leclerc and intensified efforts to locate Celeste. He also sent deputies to Théophile Boudreau's plantation with orders to bring him to protective custody by force if necessary. But when the deputies arrived at the Boudreau plantation on the evening of February 14, 1840, they found the front door standing open and a trail of indigo cloth leading from the entrance through the house and into the study. There, they found Théophile Boudreau sitting at his father's old desk, a pen in his hand, a completed letter before him. He was dead, his eyes open, that same expression of terror frozen on his face. Clutched in his other hand was a piece of indigo cloth. The letter he'd written was addressed to Celeste. The deputies read it and immediately understood that it would need to be kept from public view, for it confirmed everything Judge Marchand had suspected, and more. "You were 5 years old," the letter began. "I was 6. I watched from the ship's railing as my father ordered you and your mother thrown into the sea. I watched as you surfaced, crying for help. I watched as your mother tried to swim while holding you above water. I watched as my father laughed and said sharks would finish what he'd started. I have carried this image for 34 years. Not a day has passed that I haven't seen your face, haven't heard your mother's screams. I grew up knowing I was complicit in murder. I grew up knowing that one day, somehow, there would be a reckoning. I saw you at Duval's dinner party, and I knew immediately who you were. Your eyes were the same eyes that looked up at me from those dark waters. I knew then that you'd come back for all of us. I knew I deserved whatever fate you planned. I welcome it. I've been waiting for you to finish this, so please, if you read this before you find me, know that I do not resist. I'm sorry. I was a child, but I was old enough to know what I witnessed was wrong, and I never spoke against it. I deserve this death and worse." The letter was signed and dated February 14th, 1840. Next to it on the desk was a cup of tea still warm, with leaves floating in it that would later be identified as oleander. Théophile Boudreau had taken his own life, but only after Celeste had visited him. The servants confirmed that a woman matching her description had arrived that afternoon, had been admitted to the study at Boudreau's insistence, and had left after approximately 1 hour. She'd been carrying a small basket which she'd left behind. The basket contained fresh oleander cuttings and a small book of poetry in French. 4 men, dead. 1 left. And Armand Leclerc, secure in his guarded hotel room, was about to discover that all the protection in the world wouldn't save him from a woman who'd spent decades perfecting patience. Armand Leclerc spent 43 days under protective custody, 43 days of mounting paranoia and deteriorating mental health that transformed a proud plantation owner into a shell of his former self. The hotel room where he stayed became a prison. He refused to eat anything he hadn't personally watched being prepared from raw ingredients. He slept no more than an hour or two at a time, jerking awake at every sound. He demanded that the guards outside his door be rotated every 4 hours, convinced that Celeste could somehow bribe or seduce them if given enough time. He started drinking heavily, going through 2 bottles of brandy a day. Judge Marchand visited him regularly, trying to maintain Leclerc's cooperation with the ongoing investigation. But with each visit, Marchand found a man further from reason. Leclerc developed elaborate theories about how Celeste might reach him. Through the chimney, through a secret passage he was convinced existed in the walls, by poisoning the air itself somehow. "She's not human," Leclerc insisted during one of Marchand's visits. "No human being could do what she's done. She's something else, something we brought with us from Saint-Domingue, something that should have stayed buried in that cursed island." Marchand tried to explain that Celeste was entirely human, just exceptionally patient and knowledgeable about poisons. But Leclerc was beyond listening to reason. The manhunt for Celeste had expanded across the South. Her description had been circulated to every parish in Louisiana, every county in Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas. Slave patrols had been alerted. River pilots were questioned. Hotels and boarding houses were searched. Rewards totaling $10,000 were offered for information leading to her capture. Yet she remained invisible. It was as if she'd simply dissolved into the landscape, becoming one of thousands of enslaved women moving through the South, indistinguishable from any other in the eyes of those who never really looked at them as individuals. Then, on March 28, 1840, Armand Leclerc received a letter. It was delivered with the regular mail, mixed in with business correspondence and newspapers. The envelope was made of fine paper, sealed with indigo wax. Inside was a single sheet written in elegant handwriting. It read, "Monsieur Leclerc, you were there the night my mother died. You were on the boat. You were 14 years old enough to know right from wrong, and you did nothing. You stood next to Gaspard Boudreau and his son and watched as a woman and child were murdered for the crime of trying to be free. In the 35 years since that night, you have built a fortune on the backs of people you consider property. You have separated families, sold children away from their mothers, worked human beings to death in your cane fields. You believe yourself a good master because you provide adequate food and shelter. You believe yourself a Christian because you allow your slaves to attend church. You have never once questioned the fundamental evil of owning another human being. I am not a demon. I am not a supernatural force. I am simply the consequence of your choices, delayed but never forgotten. I am what happens when you build your prosperity on suffering and assume there will never be a reckoning. By the time you read this letter, I am already in the hotel. I have been here for 3 days watching you, waiting for the right moment. Your guards do not see me because they are not looking for me. They are looking for a beautiful slave woman, exotic and obvious. They are not looking for the chambermaid who changes your sheets, who is past 30 and plain and invisible to men like you. Tonight, you will drink your evening brandy. Tomorrow morning they will find you as they found the others. And I will move on to the next name on my list, because there are more than 5 men who profited from my mother's murder. There are dozens, and I have all the time in the world. This is not a threat you can negotiate with or a danger you can buy your way out of. This is justice delayed but inevitable. You wanted to possess me. Instead, you will join the others who tried." The letter was not signed. Leclerc immediately summoned Judge Marchand and showed him the letter. Marchand ordered an immediate search of the entire hotel. Every guest was questioned. Every employee was interrogated. Every room was inspected. They found nothing. No one matching Celeste's description was in the building. The chambermaids were all accounted for. 2 older women, both known to the hotel manager for years, and a younger woman who'd been working there for 3 months, a woman named Louise, who was nearly 40, heavy-set, with skin marked by pox scars. Marchand questioned Louise extensively. She had papers showing she was a free woman of color from Mobile, Alabama. She had references from previous employers. She had a landlord who confirmed she rented a room in town. Everything about her checked out. But there was something in her eyes when Marchand questioned her, something that made him uneasy, a kind of patient amusement, as if she was watching him struggle with a puzzle whose solution was obvious. "Have you seen anyone suspicious in the hotel?" Marchand asked her. "No, sir," she replied in an accent that sounded genuinely regional. "Just the usual guests and the gentleman in room 7 who doesn't sleep much. Monsieur Leclerc." "Yes, sir. I hear him pacing at night when I come in to tend the fires. Poor man seems very troubled." "You tend the fire in his room?" "Yes, sir. Every evening around 6 o'clock and again at 10 if he requests it." Marchand felt his stomach drop. "You've been in his room? Alone?" "Well, sir, one of the guards is always right outside the door. They watch me go in and out. I'm only there a few minutes to add wood to the fire and make sure the lamps have enough oil." Marchand turned to the guards. "How long has this woman been tending Leclerc's room?" "Since he arrived, sir." "Same as all the other rooms in the hotel. And you've watched her the entire time?" "Of course, sir. She's never done anything suspicious. Just tends the fire and leaves." Marchand looked back at Louise, really looked at her for the first time. Past the pox scars, past the weight, past the age. And there, beneath the disguise, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A flash of those unusual eyes, that golden color that had been described in every report about Celeste. "Arrest this woman," he said quietly. Louise didn't run or resist. She simply stood there, that patient smile on her face, and said, "For what crime, sir? I'm a free woman doing honest work." "You're Celeste. You wrote that letter." "My name is Louise Benoit, sir. I have papers proving it." "Your eyes, they're the same as described in the reports." "Many people have light-colored eyes, sir. That's hardly proof of anything." Marchand had her taken into custody anyway, but he knew he had a problem. If this was Celeste, she'd created a complete alternate identity, one with documentation and witnesses and a history. Without a confession or concrete proof that she'd poisoned anyone, he had no legal grounds to hold her for murder. He ordered her searched. They found nothing incriminating. No poisons, no indigo cloth, no evidence connecting her to the deaths. He had the brandy in Leclerc's room examined. It was clean, no trace of toxins. He had the firewood examined. Nothing. The lamps, the bedding, the furniture, everything was tested, all clean. Frustrated, Marchand had Louise held in a locked room at the courthouse while he tried to figure out his next move. Meanwhile, Armand Leclerc, convinced his would-be killer was now in custody, finally allowed himself to relax slightly. That night, he ate a full meal for the first time in weeks. He drank his brandy, just one glass to help him sleep. He lay down in bed, exhausted from weeks of fear and stress, and closed his eyes. The next morning, the guards found him dead, his eyes wide open, a piece of indigo cloth clutched in his hand. At the courthouse, Louise Benoit sat in her locked room, that patient smile still on her face. When Judge Marchand came to question her about Leclerc's death, she had an airtight alibi. She'd been in custody the entire time. "How?" Marchand demanded. "How did you kill him?" "I didn't kill anyone, sir. I was here, as you well know." "Then who did?" Louise leaned back in her chair, her disguise perfect, her demeanor calm. "Judge Marchand, you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't who killed Armand Leclerc. The question is, when did the poison enter his body?" Marchand stared at her, understanding beginning to dawn. "I tended his fire every evening for 43 days, Louise said softly. "Every evening I brought wood for the fire, beautiful wood carefully selected. Wood from oleander branches, dried and cured so they wouldn't be immediately recognized. Every evening for 43 days, he breathed in smoke from burning oleander. Small amounts, not enough to kill immediately, but accumulating in his body day by day, week by week. By the time you arrested me, the poison was already in him, just waiting for the accumulated dose to reach the tipping point. You're confessing to murder." "I'm explaining a hypothetical, sir. How someone might kill a man while having a perfect alibi. Of course, you'll never prove any of this. The firewood is long since burned, the smoke is gone, and I'm just a chambermaid who was doing her job. Marchand had her held for trial, but he knew she was right. He had no physical evidence, no witnesses to any crime, only circumstantial suspicion. Her trial lasted 3 days and ended with an acquittal. The jury, made up of white men who couldn't quite believe that a woman, especially an enslaved or formerly enslaved woman, could orchestrate something so sophisticated, found reasonable doubt in every element of the prosecution's case. Louise Benoit walked out of the courthouse a free woman and disappeared into the crowds of New Orleans, never to be seen again. But the story didn't end there. In the weeks and months following Armand Leclerc's death and Louise Benoit's acquittal, Judge Etienne Marchand became obsessed with tracing Celeste's complete history. He traveled to Charleston, Savannah, and Richmond, examining records and interviewing people who'd encountered her over the years. What he discovered was a campaign of revenge that had lasted over 3 decades and had claimed at least 17 victims, possibly more. Every man who'd been on that ship when Celeste and her mother were thrown overboard. Every man who'd been a business associate of Gaspard Boudreau. Every man who'd profited from the Saint-Domingue plantation system had died under mysterious circumstances over the past 15 years. Some had died suddenly, like the 5 men in St. Landry Parish. Others had been ruined financially first, watching everything they'd built collapse before they died. The methods varied, but the signature was always the same: pieces of indigo cloth and the scent of oleander. Marchand compiled all his findings into a detailed report, but he never submitted it officially. Instead, he kept it as a private document, and years later on his deathbed, he told his grandson, "I pursued her because it was my duty, but I'm glad I never caught her. What she did was murder, yes, but it was also the only form of justice available to someone who'd been denied every legal avenue for retribution. The law says slavery is legal. The law says a black woman's testimony means nothing against a white man's word. The law says she has no standing to seek recompense for her mother's murder. So she created her own justice, and she executed it with more patience and precision than any court ever could." The story of Celeste, or whatever her real name was, became a whispered legend in Louisiana. But it was a legend that made white plantation owners deeply uncomfortable, so it was suppressed, hidden, erased from official histories. The deaths were attributed to coincidence, to natural causes, to anything but a deliberate campaign of revenge. Yet in the slave quarters of plantations across the South, a different story was told. A story of a woman who'd survived the impossible, who'd learned to use intelligence and knowledge as weapons, who'd turned the master's own desires against them. She became a symbol of resistance, proof that the powerless were not actually powerless if they were patient enough and clever enough. There were reports of Celeste sightings for decades after the trial. A woman matching her description was said to be teaching school for free black children in Philadelphia in the 1850s. Another report placed her in Canada in the 1860s, helping escaped slaves find freedom. A woman who might have been her was supposedly seen in Paris in the 1870s, living as an artist. Whether any of these sightings were real is impossible to know. What is documented is this. After 1840, no more pieces of indigo cloth were found clutched in the hands of dead plantation owners. Either Celeste had completed her revenge, or she'd moved on to a different kind of life entirely. The 5 men from that dinner party in August 1839 were all dead within 7 months. Their estates were divided among heirs who squabbled over the assets and eventually sold off most of the land. The plantations they'd owned with such pride were broken up, sold, and repurposed. None of their family lines continued in St. Landry Parish. It was as if they'd been erased from history, which was perhaps exactly what Celeste had intended. In 1847, Louisiana authorities ordered all documents related to the case sealed and eventually destroyed. The official explanation was that the material was too scandalous, that it might encourage other enslaved people to attempt violence against their owners. The real reason Whispered among those who knew the truth was that the case revealed something the white power structure could never acknowledge, that they were not invulnerable, that their victims were not powerless, and that revenge could be a dish served cold over the course of decades. The last known document about Celeste was a letter found in Judge Marchand's papers after his death. The letter was addressed to him, postmarked from Boston in 1865, the same year the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. It read, "Judge Marchand, you came closer to stopping me than anyone else. You understood what I was doing and why. I've followed your career over the years, and I see you've become a voice for reform, for treating enslaved people as human beings with rights. Perhaps our encounter changed you. Perhaps seeing what revenge looks like when all legal avenues are closed made you realize that the law must serve justice for everyone, not just the powerful. The war is over now. Slavery is ending. My work is complete. The men who murdered my mother are all dead. The system that allowed it is crumbling. I can finally rest. I wanted you to know I was never a demon. I was never supernatural. I was just a woman who refused to forget, who refused to accept that some crimes are too powerful to be punished. Every night for 35 years, I remembered my mother's face as she drowned. Every day, I planned how to make the men responsible pay for what they'd done. Patience and knowledge were my only weapons, and I used them well. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect understanding. But I hope somewhere in your heart, you recognize that what I did was the only justice my mother would ever receive. The indigo cloth was from her dress, the dress she was wearing when they threw her into the sea. I kept a piece of it all these years. Every time I left a piece with a body, I was saying, her death will not be forgotten. Her murder will not go unpunished. Remember that when you judge me. The letter was not signed, but Marchand knew who'd written it. He kept the letter for the rest of his life, hidden in a locked drawer in his desk. And sometimes, late at night, he would take it out and read it, and wonder whether justice and revenge were really so different after all. The story of Celeste, the most desired slave woman in Louisiana, is not a ghost story. It's a story about the terrible patience of the oppressed, the long memory of the wronged, and the inevitable reckoning that comes when human beings are treated as property. It's a reminder that every system of injustice creates its own destroyers, and that some debts take generations to settle. In the end, 5 men paid with their lives for a crime committed in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico in 1804. And somewhere, a woman who'd survived the impossible finally found peace, knowing that her mother's death had not gone unanswered. What do you think of this story? Do you believe justice and revenge are the same thing? Do you think Celeste was right to do what she did? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story affected you, if it made you think about the hidden histories of injustice and resistance, share it with someone who appreciates dark truths about our past. Subscribe to the channel for more forgotten stories that challenge everything we think we know about history. Hit the notification bell so you never miss these deep dives into the shadows of the American past. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.